Sweet soul, before we go any further, take a breath. Right now, in this very moment, you are surrounded by light. The angels are here, hovering close, wrapping their wings around your heart, whispering something so important that they made sure this message found you today. You didn't stumble upon this by accident. You were guided here. Something moved in the invisible world and directed your attention to this moment, to these words, to this message that was prepared with your name written on every line of it. And what you are about to hear, it is going to change something deep inside you. Welcome to the Angel's Message for You original channel. This is our only official channel. Please beware of copycat and pirated channels, and stay connected to the original source for authentic angel messages and true blessings. Now, I need you to stay with me all the way to the end of this message, because what the angels are about to reveal builds, layer by layer, into something so breathtaking, so personally meant for you, that if you step away before the final words, you will miss the most powerful part. The angels are not asking much of you today. They are only asking for your time, your openness, and your willingness to believe, just for the next few minutes, that the universe is real, that love is the most powerful force in existence, and that you specifically, your life, your heart, your story, matter to the heavens in a way you may have forgotten or perhaps never fully known. Stay. Every single word that follows was placed here for you. Let us begin. Dear one, something happened. Something real. Something that crossed through the invisible walls between this world and the one beyond it. And it happened because of you. Because of the love that surrounds your life right now. Because of a soul out there who loves you so deeply, so completely, so absolutely, that even the heavens took notice and were moved. Tonight, or perhaps in the quiet hours when the world slowed down and the noise of the day faded into the background of stillness, something was set into motion. A love so pure, so raw, so completely surrendered to the universe, created a ripple that traveled far beyond what human eyes can see. It reached across time. It reached across space. It touched the very heart of the universe itself, and the universe listened, truly listened. You are the reason this happened. This is not a story being told to make you feel good for a moment and then fade like smoke. This is a message that the angels are asking you to hold close, to return to when you doubt, to remember when the signs begin to show up in your daily life, because they will. And you will know when they come that this moment right here was the beginning of everything changing. So, dear soul, let us start at the very beginning of what happened, because the angels want you to understand the full picture. They want you to know not just that something occurred, but how it occurred, so that when you feel the effects of it moving through your life, you will recognize them for what they truly are. In the silence of a sacred moment, the one who loves you most opened their heart completely to the universe. Not in a dramatic or visible way, but in the quiet, tender, deeply personal way that true surrender looks like. There were no grand gestures. There was no performance for anyone watching. There was only a heart, completely open, completely honest, speaking the kind of truth that can only come from a soul that has run out of walls to hide behind. This person sent out a call, a plea, an offering of everything they felt, all the longing, all the love, all the hope that had been building inside them perhaps for longer than they fully understood, into the hands of something greater than themselves. And in that moment of complete and total vulnerability, something remarkable happened. The universe moved. This is important, dear one. The universe does not move for just anyone. It does not stir itself for shallow wishes or passing fancies. It does not rearrange the invisible architecture of destiny for requests that are not made in complete sincerity and truth. But when a heart breaks itself open, when a soul surrenders without condition and without holding anything back, when love becomes an act of pure faith rather than an act of control, the heavens respond. Every single time, without exception. And the heavens responded for you. Angels were summoned in that moment, not called cautiously or reluctantly, but drawn by the power of what was felt and offered. They came with the kind of urgency that only pure love creates, rushing toward a heart in surrender, surrounding it with light, witnessing the sincerity of what was being asked. And they stood in witness to a love so real, so devoted, so absolutely certain of its purpose, that they had no choice but to answer. And so they did. They blessed it. They sealed it. And then, immediately, they began their work. What does that work look like, you might ask? What do angels actually do when they commit themselves to helping a love story unfold? They do the things that the human eye cannot see but the human heart can feel. Their work looks like the subtle shift you may have already started to notice. That quiet restlessness somewhere in your chest that you could not quite explain. That sense that something is changing, something is different, as if the air itself has a slightly different quality to it now. That feeling that something is coming, something good, something that matters, even when everything around you looks exactly the same as it always has. That feeling is real, dear one. That is not wishful thinking. That is not you inventing things to comfort yourself. That feeling is the echo of what happened. That is the universe confirming what was set in motion. That is the angels doing exactly what they were asked to do. Because here is what so many people miss about the way the spiritual world communicates with us. It does not announce itself with trumpets and flashing lights and unmistakable proclamations written in the sky. That is not how it works. The spiritual world speaks in whispers. It moves in the gentle shift of a mood you cannot trace to any cause. It shows itself in the song that plays at the exact moment you needed to hear those words. In the dream that leaves you with a warmth you carry with you all day long. In the thought of someone that arrives for no reason at all, right when you were beginning to wonder quietly if you were truly loved. Those are not coincidences. Those are answers. Those are the angels doing their work, sending you signs that the promise is alive and well and moving toward you with more certainty than you may yet realize. And there is a promise, dear soul. There truly is. Something was promised in that sacred moment. Not with human words that can be taken back when fear shows up or when circumstances become complicated. Not with earthly agreements that can be broken when things get difficult. But with the kind of truth that exists in the dimension where only real things live, where there is no pretending, no performance, no layer of protection between what is felt and what is expressed. On the plane where souls speak without language and intention becomes reality, a commitment was made. The one who loves you stood before everything sacred and offered up the most honest thing a soul can offer, a completely unguarded heart, saying, I choose this. I choose this person. I surrender this love to the divine and I ask for the blessing to walk this path together. That is the kind of prayer that moves mountains, dear one. That is the kind of love that the universe cannot and will not ignore. And so a promise was sealed. Not just a hope or a wish that might fade with time, but a celestial agreement. A soul-level commitment that transcended the limitations of time and of physical distance. Angels witnessed it. The universe recorded it. And now everything is being arranged, piece by careful piece, to honor it. You might be wondering, what does that mean for me? What does any of this mean in my actual life, in my daily experience, in the real world I wake up to every morning? Here is what it means. It means that things are going to start moving. The kind of movement you can feel before you can see it. Like how you can sense a change in the weather before a single cloud has appeared in the sky. There is a feeling in the atmosphere before the storm that is completely different from the stillness before nothing. And the movement that is coming toward you now feels like that. Like something gathering, like something building, like something preparing to arrive. It means that opportunities are going to line up in ways that seem almost too perfectly arranged to be random. It means that the right moments are going to arrive at the right time, as if someone invisible is stage managing everything just slightly off stage, moving the pieces so that you encounter what you need to encounter at exactly the right instant. It means that what once felt impossibly far away is going to begin to feel close, because it is close, because it was always going to be close, because this story was always going to arrive at this chapter. Dear one, the angels want you to understand something specific about the love that surrounds your life right now. This is not ordinary love. This is not the kind of connection that comes and goes with the seasons, that shines brightly for a little while and then fades when the circumstances change. This is not something that exists only when it is convenient or comfortable or easy. What exists between you and this person has been part of your story for far longer than either of you may consciously realize. Woven in at a level so deep that it has survived every test, every doubt, every moment of distance or confusion. Souls that are meant for each other recognize each other. Not always immediately, not always in a clean and straightforward moment of clarity, but always, eventually, undeniably. There comes a moment when the recognition is so complete, so absolutely clear, that no argument, no doubt, no fear can stand against it. That moment feels different from everything that came before it. It has a quality of inevitability, as if you are not discovering something new but remembering something old. Something that was always true. That moment is coming for you. And the reason it is coming now, rather than in some unspecified distant future, is because of what was done on your behalf. Because a heart that loves you chose, in an act of extraordinary courage and faith, to surrender completely. Chose to lay everything down before the universe and say, "Not my will, but yours," and trust, without holding on to anything in reserve, that the answer would be good. That is an act of extraordinary faith. And faith, dear one, is the most powerful force in the universe. Not because it operates like magic that can be summoned on demand, but because it aligns a human heart with divine intention. And when a human heart aligns with divine intention, truly, completely, without reservation, things that seemed impossible begin to happen naturally, easily, as if they were always just waiting for the right invitation to come into being. You received that invitation. Now, let us talk about something that happened while you were still and quiet, perhaps in the deep peacefulness of sleep, perhaps in that gentle twilight space between waking and dreaming, perhaps in one of those beautiful in-between moments when the everyday world goes a little soft and something deeper than ordinary reality becomes accessible. In one of those moments, something extraordinary occurred. Your soul and the soul of this person met. Not in the physical world, not in any way that could be captured in a photograph or explained in ordinary language, but in the place beyond ordinary understanding. On a higher plane, in the space where all souls are accessible to each other when the conditions are right and the hearts are true, there was a reunion, an exchange, a meeting that had no words but carried more meaning than all the words in every language that has ever existed on this earth. In that meeting, things were shared that the waking mind might not be able to fully access, but the heart felt them. The body felt them. There are ways that the soul communicates its experiences back to us that bypass the reasoning mind entirely, speaking directly to our emotional center, our gut, our most honest and vulnerable interior. Do you remember waking up with an inexplicable feeling of being loved? Do you remember a moment of warmth that came from seemingly nowhere, that wrapped around you like something gentle and safe and held you for a little while before fading? Do you remember sensing a presence, as if someone was near, someone familiar, someone who felt like home? That was real, dear one. That was not your imagination constructing comfort for you out of nothing. That was the meeting of two souls in the space where all true things live, and what was exchanged there is now permanently woven into the fabric of your connection. Cannot be undone. It does not fade with time. It strengthens. The angels want you to know that this exchange deepened everything between you. It cleared old doubts that had been sitting in the spaces between you like fog. It reinforced the truth of this connection at the most fundamental level. It reminded both of your souls, in a way that went far deeper than thought or feeling, that this love is real, that this path is real, and that this destination is not a dream but a certainty. You are not walking towards something uncertain. You are walking towards something that has already been decided in the highest of places. The only question was timing, and timing, dear soul, is being handled by hands far more capable than yours or mine. Let us talk about what is happening right now in the invisible world around you. Imagine, if you can, a dedicated team of angels, not 2 or 3, but many, all focused entirely and completely on your story. Each one has a specific role. Some are clearing the path ahead of you, removing obstacles before you even encounter them, dissolving blocks that could have caused delays, opening doors in places you haven't reached yet and couldn't even see from where you currently stand. Some are working on the circumstances of your life, gently arranging events and encounters and moments of synchronicity so that everything lines up in the most harmonious way possible. Some are working on the heart of the one who loves you, supporting that person's courage, filling in the spaces where fear tries to take hold, preparing them to show up for you in the fullness of who they truly are, without walls and without hesitation. And some of them, perhaps the most devoted, most attentive ones, are walking right beside you. Right now, as you receive these words, they are present. You cannot see them with your physical eyes, but your soul knows they are there. It knows in the same wordless way that we know we are safe before we have identified the specific reason we feel safe. An instinct, a recognition, a settling. Their only job in this moment is to help this message reach your heart in exactly the way it is meant to make sure you feel the truth of it landing, to make sure something shifts. Is something shifting? Because the angels are asking you that directly. They want to know if you feel it, that slight but undeniable loosening somewhere in your chest, that small but significant sense that maybe, just maybe, you don't have to carry the weight of uncertainty alone anymore, that maybe the universe really is in charge, that maybe you really are loved, protected, guided, not because you earned it through any particular action or achievement, but simply because you are, because you exist, because your soul was placed in this world with intention and purpose and a story that is meant to be fully lived. You are loved because you exist. You are guided because your story matters. You are because the angels were assigned to you before you took your first breath in this world. And they have not left your side, not even for a single moment, through every difficult thing you have experienced and every joy that has touched your life. Dear one, now let us go even deeper. Let us talk about what this love actually feels like from the inside of the heart that carries it. Because the angels want you to understand not just the spiritual dimensions of what is happening, but the human, tender, completely real experience of what the person who loves you is living with every day. Before we go deeper into today's message, if you feel guided by this energy, you can sow your seed for your soulmate's well-being and protection through the Ko-Fi link Super Thanks in the description or pinned comment. This is a simple way to support this divine mission and invite blessings for your soulmate journey, emotional healing, and overall well-being. Many believe that when you give with a pure heart, it returns as love, peace, happiness, and abundance in your life. Your support helps this channel continue spreading divine messages, guidance, and hope to many souls around the world. The one who loves you holds you in a way that is difficult to describe with ordinary words. This is not a love that lives only in the easy moments, only when everything is going well and the path is clear. It is not a love that exists on the condition that things stay comfortable. This is a love that has already been tested by distance, by uncertainty, by the silence that sometimes stretches between two people who long for each other and cannot close the gap as quickly as they wish. And through all of that, it has not broken. It has not broken because it is rooted in something that ordinary circumstances cannot reach. It is rooted in the recognition of one soul by another, that ancient, wordless, completely inexplicable knowing that happens somewhere below the level of thought, in the place where we are most essentially ourselves, before the world taught us to protect ourselves with walls and conditions and careful management of our own hearts. This person thinks of you at unexpected moments. When the light falls in a particular way at the end of an afternoon. When a piece of music touches something unguarded. In the early morning, in that quiet space before the day's obligations arrive. When everything is still and the heart speaks its most honest truth without interference. In those moments you arrive, not always as a conscious, deliberate thought, but as a feeling, as a presence, as a warmth that spreads through the chest and stays for a while. You are never far from this person's heart. And on the night that the angels are describing, the night when the call went out and the universe moved, everything that this love had accumulated over time was placed at the feet of God with complete and utter surrender. Every hope, every fear, every prayer that had been sent out, and every silent wish that had been whispered into the darkness at moments when this person could feel how real this love was and how much they wanted it to find its way home to you. All of it, every single piece of it was offered up, and God received it. You might find yourself wondering what it means for God to receive something. What actually happens in the spiritual dimension when we lay something at the feet of the divine? What changes? Here is what changes. Something shifts from the category of what we are trying to manage and control, holding it tightly, worrying about it, planning and strategizing around it, into the category of what is being taken care of. And once something is genuinely being taken care of by the divine, truly released, truly surrendered with no part of it held back in our grip, it moves differently. It moves without the weight of fear pressing down on it. It moves in the direction of its truest, most beautiful purpose. And the truest purpose of this love is you. The truest purpose of everything this person has felt, everything this person has carried, everything this person has hoped and prayed and longed for, is the life they are meant to build alongside you. Not a perfect life, not a life without challenges, not a fairy tale that exists outside the real world, but a real, full, breathing, alive in every moment life that the two of you are meant to create together, step by step, day by day, in all its beautiful and ordinary and extraordinary moments. That is what was surrendered to God. Not a wish, not a fantasy, a real life, and God accepted it. And the angels got to work. Dear one, the angels now want to speak to something you may have been carrying quietly. Something you may not have said out loud to anyone, perhaps not even fully formed it into a complete thought for yourself, but something that sits with you in the stillness nonetheless. You have wondered, haven't you, if you are truly lovable? If what you want is really possible for someone like you? If the love you dream about is something that actually exists in this real world, or only in the stories we tell ourselves to make the hard parts of life more bearable? You have looked at your life, at the places where things have not gone the way you hoped, at the times when love has disappointed or confused or simply not arrived, and you have wondered, sometimes very quietly, if maybe there is something about you that makes the big love, the real love, the forever kind of love, just a little bit harder to reach. The angels see that wondering. They see all of it. and they want to speak directly into that tender, quiet place in you right now. You are worthy of the love you seek. Not someday. Not once you have resolved certain things about yourself or your life. Not after you have become some improved future version of who you are right now. But now, today, exactly as you are, with every unresolved thing still sitting exactly where it sits, with every wound still in the process of healing, with every beautiful, complicated, fully human piece of who you are just as it is. You are worthy, completely, unconditionally, without exception, without fine print, worthy of being loved exactly the way you deserve to be loved. The angels do not grade souls on a scale of earned worthiness. They do not calculate whether you have done enough good or been enough or tried hard enough to deserve having your prayers answered. They look at you and they see the light that was placed inside you before you ever took your first breath in this body. They see the full truth of who you are at the level where nothing is hidden, where all pretending falls away, where what remains is simply the original, irreducible, completely sacred soul that you have always been. And that soul, your soul, is completely worthy of this love. Take a quick second before we move forward. Many channels are reposting and copying our content, but authentic energy cannot be duplicated. For the strongest positive connection and divine guidance, always listen from the original Angel's Message for You channel with the black logo base. Now, let's continue with the message your angels want you to hear. Let no voice inside you, no old fear that has been living in you since some painful moment that taught you to protect yourself, no worn-out story you absorbed about what you deserve or what is possible for you, no echo from a time when someone treated you as if you were less than you are. Let none of those voices convince you that what the angels are telling you right now is not meant for you. It is meant for you. All of it. Every single word of it. Now, dear one, let us talk about what to do with all of this. Because receiving a message from the angels is a beautiful thing. But the angels also understand very well that beautiful things need to be met with action. Not frantic action. Not forcing things or grasping or trying to make things happen ahead of their natural time. But a gentle, intentional, trusting kind of stepping toward what is already on its way to you. So what do they ask of you? First, they ask you to open to receiving. This sounds very simple, and in a certain way it is simple. But for many souls it is actually one of the most challenging things to do, because receiving requires vulnerability. It requires letting something in rather than keeping it at a manageable arm's length. It requires allowing yourself to believe, fully and without reservation, that good things are actually coming, and that they are coming specifically for you. Wait, your angels are asking me to pause for a moment because this message is not random, and it is not meant for everyone. Only a small number of people listening right now will truly understand why this is showing up today. If you've been feeling stuck in the same emotional pattern, waiting for someone to finally choose you, value you, or show up differently, yet nothing seems to change no matter how much you pray, overthink, or try to let go, this interruption is for you. There is a very specific energy I'm picking up today. Someone has been silently wondering, why does love feel so close, yet still so out of reach? Someone listening has been praying the same quiet prayer for months, maybe even years. Late at night, when the world is silent, you've asked, God, what am I missing? Why does it feel like I'm almost there, but never receiving it fully? Why do I keep attracting confusion instead of clarity and love? And even when you stopped speaking it out loud, your heart kept asking anyway. Your angels are showing me that this has not gone unnoticed. The waiting, the emotional exhaustion, the repeated disappointments, none of it has been invisible to divine timing. But here is what your angels want you to understand today. The blockage may not be in your destiny. but in the energetic patterns surrounding how love is being received. Sometimes the universe is not saying no. It is saying, not like this, not from this energy, not from this frequency. Divine guidance often arrives as a whisper, not a breakthrough explosion. And today's whisper is this: you are closer than you think. But something within the dynamic needs to shift first. If I wasn't planning to share this today, but this kept appearing repeatedly in different moments, almost like a quiet nudge I couldn't ignore. Every time I sat down to continue this message, I kept feeling guided back to one specific resource, something that explains the emotional and relational patterns people experience when love feels unbalanced, confusing, or inconsistent. It didn't feel like coincidence, felt like timing. That's when I came across something called Make Him Worship You. Now I want you to hear this clearly, not as an advertisement, but as a possible answer placed in your path. It's a relationship guidance resource designed to help you understand emotional dynamics, attraction patterns, and how to shift the energy in love so connection feels more secure, more valued, and more emotionally aligned. Not by chasing, not by forcing, but by understanding what actually creates deep emotional respect and devotion in relationships. I want to share something I heard from someone who found this during a very confusing phase in their love life. She had been in a cycle where the person she cared about was inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes distant. She found herself constantly overthinking messages, reading into silence, and feeling emotionally drained. One night, she said she broke down and simply asked for clarity. That's when she came across this material. She didn't expect much. She was just searching for understanding. But over time, something shifted. She started recognizing patterns she had never noticed before, how her emotional reactions were shaping the dynamic more than she realized. She didn't force anything, but her energy changed, her confidence changed, and gradually, the connection either stabilized or she gained the clarity to walk away without confusion. For her, it wasn't magic. It was awareness that brought peace. This is not about controlling someone. It's about transforming how you experience love. Feeling emotionally grounded instead of anxious. Gaining clarity instead of confusion. Understanding relationship dynamics more deeply. Rebuilding inner confidence in love, releasing emotional overwhelm, strengthening your intuition in relationships, moving from uncertainty into calm awareness. What if the breakthrough you've been praying for is closer than you think? What if nothing is actually missing, but something is simply misunderstood? What if your next level in love begins with awareness, not effort? What if this moment is not a delay, but divine alignment preparing you? Imagine 6 months from now, you wake up with emotional peace instead of anxiety. You no longer replay conversations in your mind. You feel steady, calm, and emotionally secure in your own energy. And whether you are in a relationship or not, you no longer feel lost inside uncertainty. You feel guided, aware, and grounded. That version of you is not far away. For some people, this won't be information. It will be confirmation. This may be the sign you asked for. This may be the answer you've been waiting to receive without realizing it. If something in this message stirred your heart, don't ignore it. Don't rush it either, but don't dismiss it. Some guidance is not meant to be postponed indefinitely. It is meant to be acknowledged when it resonates. The link is available in the video description and pinned comment. If you feel guided, pray about it, reflect on it, and only follow what feels aligned for you. Your angels are not asking you to force love or force outcomes. They are asking you to become energetically ready for what you've been praying for. Take what resonates and leave what doesn't. Now, let's return to today's angel message. We have often been trained by life to prepare for disappointment. We hold back our hope because we know from experience that hope can be painful when things do not work out. We protect ourselves by not letting ourselves believe completely, so that if things go differently than we wish, the fall is not too far. The angels are asking you to set that particular protection down. Not recklessly, not in a way that abandons all wisdom or discernment, but at the deepest level, in the most private, most honest interior of your own heart. They are asking you to say yes. Yes to this love. Yes to the possibility of it arriving fully and beautifully in your life. Yes to being ready to receive it when it comes. Yes to allowing yourself to believe, without the safety net of managed expectations, that the universe is truly, genuinely, lovingly working for you. That yes is an act of power. It is an energetic act of alignment with everything that is being prepared. When you say yes in your heart to what is on its way, you become more capable of recognizing it when it arrives. You become more present to the signs. You become more available to the moments that matter. You become a clearer, more open vessel for all the good that is already moving toward you. Say yes, dear one. Let yourself mean it. Second, the angels ask you to trust the timing. This is perhaps the most challenging of all the things they are asking, because trust in timing requires a kind of faith that does not come naturally when we are waiting for something we want with our whole heart. Requires believing, really believing, not just saying it, that the universe's schedule is not a punishment or a test of endurance but a preparation. That the reason everything is not fully here yet is not because it is not coming, but because it is being made ready, being made perfect, being arranged so that when it arrives, it will be everything it is meant to be and nothing will be out of place. Think about a seed in the ground. It is doing something profound down there in the dark, in the quiet, in the invisible space where growth happens before it can be seen. It is becoming what it is meant to be, going through a transformation that requires exactly the right conditions, exactly the right amount of time, and the freedom to proceed at the pace the process requires. And if you were to reach into the soil and pull it up early, impatient for the flower, wanting to see the result before the work is done, you would interrupt the very process that the flower requires. The timing of growth is not arbitrary. It is precise. It serves the life of the flower. Your love is being grown with the same precision. It is being developed and strengthened and prepared in exactly the right conditions, at exactly the right pace, and when it emerges fully into your life, it will be everything it was always meant to be, complete, strong, rooted, and ready to last. Trust the timing, dear one. The angels promise you. It is working even when you cannot see it working, especially then. Third, the angels ask you to pay attention. Not with anxiety, not with the kind of constant scanning and scrutinizing that comes from fear and produces exhaustion, but with the gentle, open, curious attentiveness of someone who knows that the universe is always speaking, in 1,000 different small ways, and who has made the choice to listen more carefully than before. The signs will come in the smallest things. A feather in a place where feathers do not typically appear. A sequence of numbers that catches your eye again and again. A song that begins to play at the exact moment that corresponds perfectly with what you are feeling or thinking. A dream that stays with you long after you wake. A moment when someone says something that lands in your chest as if it were placed there specifically for you, in this moment with your name on it. A warmth that comes over you for no reason at all, just warmth, just a sense of being loved, just the quiet presence of something good. Do not explain these things away. Do not file them under coincidence and carry on as if they were nothing. When you notice something, pause. Take a breath. Say thank you out loud or silently, it does not matter. Acknowledge that the universe is communicating with you and that you are present enough to receive it. That acknowledgement matters. It deepens the connection between you and the invisible world that is working on your behalf. It tells the angels that you are aware and listening and open, and they will respond. Dear one, we are drawing now toward the most important and final part of this message. The part the angel said was most essential for you to carry with you when this message is complete. Everything that has been shared here, the prayer, the surrender, the celestial promise, the alignment of the universe, the angels working on your behalf, all of it is pointing toward one moment. One specific, real, tangible event in your actual life. A meeting, an encounter, a moment when what has been true in the invisible world becomes undeniably and beautifully visible in the world you can see and touch and live in every day. That moment is coming, and the angels are not speaking in vague, distant, unspecified terms. They are speaking about something that is already in motion, already drawing closer, already being arranged with care and with love. The paths are being set. The events are being shaped. The moment is being designed with the same kind of devotion and precision that goes into the most important things, because this is one of the most important things that will happen in your life. When it happens, dear soul, you will know. Not because it will be flawless or perfectly scripted or entirely free of any nervousness or uncertainty. Not because the sky will open up and a voice will declare this is it. But because something inside you, something deep and old and wise, will recognize it. Your soul will say, not necessarily in words but in the clearest possible feeling, here, this is it. This is what I was waiting for. And there will be a peace in that recognition that is different from anything you have felt before. The kind of peace that does not come from the absence of all uncertainty, but from the presence of something that is simply, undeniably, completely true. You will feel it in your body before your mind fully catches up to it. You will feel it as a settling, as a coming home, as the sense of a search that has finally reached its destination. And the beauty of it will not be diminished by the fact that you waited. It will be deepened by it. Because everything you lived through on the way here, every moment of wondering and hoping and trusting when it was hard to trust, will have prepared you to receive this love with your whole heart. Open, ready, grateful beyond words. And when you feel that, when that moment arrives and your soul says yes, remember this. Remember that the angels told you it was coming. Remember that a love was surrendered on your behalf and the universe was moved by it. Remember that every detail was arranged. Remember that you were always worthy of this. Because you were, you are, you will always be. Dear one, we have arrived at the very end of this message. And there is one final thing the angels want to say before they rest. One thing they want to leave settled in your heart like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples that continue long after the moment itself has passed. You are not alone. You have never been alone. Not in the hardest moments you have ever lived through. Not in the darkest nights when the weight of things felt almost too heavy to carry. Not in the times when everything felt uncertain and you could not find solid ground anywhere. Not in the moments when you were quiet and no one else could see what you were feeling. The universe could see. The angels could see. And they stayed. In every single one of those moments, the angels were present. In every single one of those moments, the love that is meant for you was being protected, prepared, and held safely until the time was right. In every single one of those moments, the universe was quietly, persistently, devotedly, lovingly working on your story. Nothing has been wasted, not a single tear, Not a single prayer that felt like it disappeared into the silence without being heard. Not a single night of wondering if you were truly loved, if your heart would ever find its home. All of it, every single piece of it, was part of the path that has been leading you, step by step and sometimes stumble by stumble, toward this moment, toward this message, toward the threshold of everything changing. You are standing on that threshold right now, dear one. The door is open, the light is on, and the love of your life, the one who already surrendered everything to the universe, to God, to the angels, to the sacred promise of this connection, is on the other side. Not far, much closer than you may realize, being drawn toward you by the same invisible force that is drawing you toward them, moving through their own life with a growing sense that something is about to change, that something is getting closer, that the love they have been carrying is about to find its way home. Trust it, feel it, welcome it into your heart right now, even before it has fully arrived. Welcome it the way you would welcome the warmth of sunlight after a long winter, not with desperation, but with gratitude, with the deep, quiet joy of someone who knows the cold is ending, and know that in the days ahead, as the signs become more frequent and more clear, as the feeling of something coming grows from a quiet whisper into something that is simply undeniable, all of it is real. All of it is the promise being kept. All of it is the angels saying, "We heard you, we see you, we love you, and we are bringing it home." May your heart be filled with peace right now, in this very moment. May every fear that has been sitting heavy in you begin to soften, like frost in the first warmth of spring. May you feel, even if only for a breath or two, the gentle and absolute certainty of the angel wings that are wrapped around you at this second. You are loved, dear one, profoundly, completely, eternally loved by the universe, by God, by the angels who have been beside you all along, and by the heart that placed you in the hands of heaven and asked that nothing keep you apart. The best is still ahead of you. It is close. It is real. It is yours. Dear beautiful soul, this angel's message for you channel is a sacred spiritual home, created for faith, healing, and divine guidance. A place where hearts awaken and lives are gently transformed through divine messages. We warmly invite you to subscribe and stay connected, because the divine is always preparing something greater for your journey, something you are meant to receive in divine timing. If you feel moved to support this mission, you can sow your seed here for your soulmate blessings and divine love fulfillment. Your contribution is not just support. It is an energetic agreement with love, healing, and divine alignment in your own life. When you give with intention, it opens doors. Love flows more freely, happiness expands, and abundance multiplies in unexpected ways. Many believe that giving in faith activates a return of peace, joy, and emotional fulfillment in relationships and life. Whether it is $6, $11, $22, or $55, your generosity helps us continue spreading these divine messages of hope, healing, and soulmate guidance across the world. Every seed sown into this mission helps hearts heal, faith return, and souls reconnect with love. This is more than a channel. It is a movement of light, unity, and divine timing. Your support allows this sacred work to grow, touching lives that are searching for answers, comfort, and spiritual direction. We are all connected in this journey, and together we rise as one community under divine love. Let us open our hearts to the abundance that is already on its way. Amen.